My daughter looked at the judge and said I could no longer be trusted to run my own life. She had no idea I still ran 3. The courtroom smelled like old paper and cold coffee, the kind of room built for patience, not comfort. I sat alone at the table on the left, hands folded, back straight, the way my mother taught me to sit in church. Across the aisle, Rebecca sat beside her attorney, a young man in a gray suit who kept glancing at his notes like they might rearrange themselves into something stronger. She forgets things, Rebecca was saying. She leaves the stove on. She gets confused about dates. I love her, Your Honor, but she's not safe living alone anymore. I did not interrupt. I did not gasp or shake my head or reach for a tissue the way I think she expected me to. I simply waited until she finished, and then I asked, quietly, if I might see the petition she had filed. Rebecca rolled her eyes. Actually rolled them, the same way she used to at 16 when I asked where she was going on a Friday night. As if the question itself proved her point. The judge did not roll her eyes. She looked at me a moment longer than she needed to. The way people look at something that doesn't quite match the story they've been told. A woman who forgets things does not sit this still. Does not ask this clearly for a document. Does not wait this patiently to be heard. In front of me, untouched, was a plain manila folder. I hadn't opened it. I didn't need to, not yet. But it sat there the entire hearing like a held breath, and more than once I noticed the judge's eyes drift toward it. Curious about what a woman who supposedly couldn't manage her own affairs would bring to a courtroom and choose not to use. We'll take a short recess, the judge said, before I hear anything further. Rebecca exhaled, satisfied, already certain of how this would end. She had grown up believing she knew everything about her mother. What she didn't know was where I'd come from, what I'd built with my own 2 hands long before she was old enough to notice, and exactly why that folder was going to matter. I was 62 when my husband died, and 38 when I stopped waiting for anyone to take care of me. Robert passed young, a heart that gave out on an ordinary Tuesday, and left me with a mortgage, a 10-year-old daughter, and a bookkeeping job at a hardware supply company that paid just enough to keep the lights on if I was careful. So I was careful. I learned to be careful the way some people learn a language, out of necessity, until it became something I simply was. I kept the bookkeeping job for 31 years. I balanced other people's ledgers all day and came home to balance my own. And somewhere in those quiet evenings at the kitchen table, I started doing something no one in my family ever noticed. I bought a small duplex 2 streets over, the kind no one else wanted, with a leaking roof and a tenant 3 months behind on rent. I fixed the roof myself with a book from the library and a neighbor who owed me a favor. 10 years later, I bought a second one. Then closer to retirement, a third. I never mentioned any of it at Sunday dinners. When Rebecca's aunts asked how I was getting by, I let them assume what they wanted. That I had my pension, my social security, and not much else. It was easier that way. Money has a way of changing how people look at you, and I had already raised a daughter alone. I didn't feel like defending a life I'd built in silence to people who'd never once asked how I built it. They thought she lived on social security. She lived on discipline. There was one habit of mine that everyone found a little old-fashioned, a little unnecessary. I insisted that every property be properly titled, every agreement between me and a contractor or a tenant put in writing, signed, dated, filed away in a cabinet Robert had bought years before he died. Just in case. I always said, when someone asked why a woman with 3 small rental units needed so much paperwork. My sister used to tease me about it. Rebecca rolled her eyes at it more than once, the same way she would, years later, in that courtroom. I didn't do it because I expected betrayal. I did it because I had learned, the hard way, that the world does not owe a widow the benefit of the doubt. And paper was the only language it consistently respected. It was years after that, long after the duplexes were paid off, long after Rebecca had a husband and a house of her own, that the small things started. Nothing dramatic. Nothing anyone could point to and call cruel. Just the quiet, gradual sense of being written out of my own life, one decision at a time. The first time, I told myself it was nothing. My gutters needed replacing, and I mentioned it to Rebecca in passing, the way you mention weather. A week later, a crew showed up unannounced, hired and paid for by her, without a single question about what I wanted or which company I trusted. When I asked why she hadn't called me first, she said she was just trying to help, that I had enough to worry about. I told myself she was busy. Young people are busy. The second time was smaller, and somehow it stung more. My granddaughter's 9th birthday came and went, and I found out about it 3 days later from a photograph on Rebecca's sister-in-law's page. When I asked gently why I hadn't been told, Rebecca said they'd kept it small this year, just immediate family, and that she hadn't wanted to trouble me with the drive. I told myself it was a misunderstanding. Surely I still counted as immediate family. The third time, I couldn't explain away quite so easily. Rebecca's husband, Daniel, was at my kitchen table fixing a cabinet hinge, and he said almost cheerfully that once they finally figured out what to do with Mom's houses eventually, they'd have enough to finish their basement properly. He said it the way you'd mention a future vacation. Not cruel. Not even thinking about it. Just certain already of an inheritance I had never once discussed with anyone. I didn't correct him. I refilled his coffee and changed the subject, and later that night I sat at my own kitchen table and told myself, again, that people don't always choose their words carefully. That assumption isn't theft. That I was being sensitive about nothing. Marjorie didn't let me get away with that one. We'd been friends since our daughters were in diapers together, and she had never once been afraid to say the thing I didn't want to hear. When I told her about the gutters, the birthday, the cabinet hinge, she set down her coffee cup harder than she needed to. They're not confused about your memory, Ellie, she said. They're confused about your money. I laughed it off, told her she was being dramatic. But something in me had already started keeping score quietly, the way I'd once kept score of every dollar after Robert died. It was around then that Rebecca started asking, in that same casual tone she used for weather and birthdays, whether I had everything in order. Whether my will was updated. Whether I'd thought about what would happen if something happened to me. Always phrased gently. Always phrased as concern. I answered honestly each time. Yes, everything was in order, more than she knew. And each time, something in her face suggested that wasn't quite the answer she'd been hoping for. I didn't know yet how soon those casual questions would stop being casual at all. Rebecca came by on a Sunday afternoon with a manila envelope and a smile that was trying too hard to look casual. I want to make things easier, she said, sliding the papers across my kitchen table, like they were nothing more than a grocery list. Just a simple power of attorney. And while we're at it, we should add my name to the deeds. For tax purposes. It'll save us both a headache later. I looked at the papers longer than she expected me to. The language wasn't the plain, generic wording you'd find in a template from an office supply store. It was specific. Careful. The kind of language a lawyer writes, not the kind a daughter drafts on a Sunday afternoon out of love. Who prepared this? I asked. She hesitated. Just a beat too long. A friend, she said. Someone who knows about this stuff. I let the silence sit there for a moment before I asked the only question that mattered. Which properties does this cover, Rebecca? The ones you know about, or all of them? The room went still in a way I don't think she expected a kitchen could go still. Daniel, who'd been pretending to check his phone at the counter, looked up. Rebecca's smile faltered just slightly, before she caught it and pulled it back into place. What do you mean all of them? She said. I just mean the duplexes. I just want to help, Mom. Before something happens to you. Is that so wrong? It wasn't the question that troubled me. It was the phrase itself. All of them. And the way her eyes had flicked just once toward the envelope before she answered. As if she were checking her own memory against a list she hadn't fully memorized. A woman asking to help with 3 rental properties does not need paperwork this precise. Paperwork this precise is written by someone hoping to cover more ground than they're willing to say out loud. I slid the envelope back across the table and signed. I'll have my own attorney look it over, I said gently. That's all. Nothing personal. Rebecca's jaw tightened, just for a second, before she smoothed it into something more patient. Fine, she said. I just don't want us to be scrambling later. That's all I'm trying to prevent. I told her I understood. I told her I appreciated her concern. I did not tell her that in 30 years of managing my own affairs, I had never once needed anyone to scramble on my behalf, and I did not intend to start now. She left without the papers. She left, I would later learn, already deciding that if I wouldn't sign willingly, there was another way to get what she wanted. One that didn't require my signature at all. I had no idea, that Sunday, just how far that other way would go. It was such a small, ordinary reason to be sitting at her desk. My printer had run out of ink, and I wanted a copy of my mother's pot roast recipe before Sunday dinner, so I asked Rebecca if I could use her laptop while she was upstairs folding laundry. She said of course, barely looking up, and went about her afternoon as if nothing in the world was about to change. The laptop was already open. I wasn't looking for anything. I want to be clear about that, even now. I wasn't searching, wasn't suspicious, wasn't hunting for proof of anything. I was simply looking for the search bar when I saw the email sitting there, already open on the screen, subject line reading next steps, guardianship filing. I should have looked away. I didn't. The thread went back nearly 6 weeks. An attorney named Gregory Hale, someone I had never heard of, someone who had clearly never met me, walking Rebecca through what he called the guardianship process, and what would happen to my assets once a court declared me incapacitated. He used that word, incapacitated, the way you'd use a word from a form, clinical and distant, as if he were discussing a stranger's furniture rather than a living woman's life. Further down, my stomach went cold in a way I hadn't felt since the week after Robert died. The email mentioned the duplexes by address. It mentioned asset consolidation once guardianship is established. And then near the bottom, a line that made me sit very still in my daughter's desk chair. A reference to a savings account, one Rebecca described to her attorney as larger than we originally expected, with a note that once guardianship was granted, the full picture would need to be reassessed. She didn't know the real number. That was the strange, small comfort in it. She'd stumbled onto evidence of an account I'd built quietly over decades and had no real understanding of what it actually held, only that it was more than she'd assumed, which had apparently been enough to set all of this in motion. I read the thread once, and then I made myself read it again, slower, the way I used to read a client's ledger when a number didn't sit right. Checking this time not for an error, but for how deliberate this had been. There was no error. It was organized. It was patient. It had been planned for weeks, possibly months, while my daughter sat across from me at Sunday dinners asking if I had everything in order, smiling the whole time. I closed the laptop gently, the way you close a door you don't want anyone to hear latch. I printed my mother's recipe. I said goodbye to Rebecca that afternoon exactly the way I always did. And I did not let my voice carry a single thing I now knew. I drove home in silence. I did not cry, though I understood, somewhere in the drive, that I might have earned the right to. Instead, once I was home, I sat at my own kitchen table, poured a cup of tea I didn't drink, and picked up the phone to call the one person who had known the true shape of my finances longer than my own daughter ever had. The person I called was Walter Pines, and he had known the true shape of my life for nearly 30 years, longer than Rebecca had been an adult, longer than she had ever thought to ask. 2 years after Robert died, when I had finally saved enough to buy that first small duplex, Walter was the one who sat across from me at his cluttered downtown office, and asked a question no one else in my life had ever bothered to ask. What would happen to everything I built if something happened to me? Not when I died, but before that, if my mind or my body ever failed me first. I had watched it happen to my own aunt. A house, a modest savings account, and a nephew who convinced a judge she couldn't manage either one, long before anyone checked whether that was even true. I never forgot how quickly it happened, how little proof it took, how completely her voice disappeared from her own life the moment someone else decided she was incapable of using it. So when Walter asked, I already knew my answer. We didn't simply put my name on those properties. We placed the duplexes and later the savings account Rebecca had stumbled onto in that email into a revocable trust, with Walter's firm serving as professional trustee. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't secretive in the way people imagine secrets to be. It was paperwork, careful and precise, the same instinct that made me title every deed and write down every agreement, taken one deliberate step further. The trust had one clause I insisted on above all the others. Control could not shift to anyone, for any reason, without 2 independent medical evaluations confirming genuine incapacity, followed by the trustee's own review and approval. Not a judge's assumption. not a family member's convenience, not a daughter's belief that she was only trying to help. 2 doctors, a professional trustee, and my own paper trail standing between me and anyone who ever mistook my age for permission. I never told Rebecca. Not because I didn't trust her, or at least, not only because of that. I didn't want the 2 of us to sit across a dinner table with an inheritance hanging in the air between every conversation we ever had. I wanted her to know her mother, not her mother's balance sheet. So I let the assumption stand. I let her believe those duplexes sat in my name alone, unprotected, waiting. She wasn't wrong that I had built something worth wanting. She was wrong about how easily it could be taken. I understood, sitting at my kitchen table with the phone against my ear, why her petition hadn't already collapsed on its own. A guardianship over my person and a trust protecting my assets are not the same fight. And unless someone actually knew to challenge the trust directly, a judge could grant guardianship over me while the trust itself sat completely untouched, waiting for a challenge no one yet knew to make. Rebecca's attorney hadn't requested a single medical evaluation. He hadn't approached Walter's firm at all. He was building a case against a version of my finances that no longer existed the way he assumed it did. She wasn't hiding money. She was protecting a future she knew someone might try to take. "Walter," I said quietly into the phone, "I think it's time you came to court with me." Mr. Alvarez had handled small legal matters for me over the years. A boundary dispute with a neighbor, a lease dispute with a difficult tenant, nothing that had ever prepared either of us for a guardianship hearing. But when I called him and explained what I'd found, and what Walter and I had built years before, he asked me to bring every document I had to his office the following morning. He spread the papers across his desk like a man reading 2 different stories about the same woman. "Here's what your daughter's petition claims," he said, tapping one stack. "That you're incapacitated, that you're unsafe living alone, and that a guardian should be appointed over your person and your property." He moved his hand to the second stack, thicker, older, the pages I'd carried in from Walter's office decades ago. "And here's what your trust actually says. That no one, not a guardian, not a family member, not even a court ruling on guardianship over your person, can touch a single asset inside this trust without 2 independent medical evaluations, and the trustee's own approval first. So the guardianship and the trust aren't the same fight," I said slowly, working it through the way I once worked through a stubborn ledger. "Exactly. A court can rule on your personal care without ever touching what's inside that trust. The only way anyone reaches these accounts is by challenging the trust itself, directly, with proper medical evidence." He sifted through the file Walter had sent over. "And there's no record of anyone contacting his office. No evaluation request. Nothing." I sat with that for a moment before the sharper question surfaced. "If they never filed for the trust evaluation," I asked, "how did they expect to reach the accounts at all?" Alvarez set the papers down and looked at me for a long moment. "Honestly, Mrs. Hartley, I don't think they know this trust exists." The room went quiet around that sentence the way my kitchen had gone quiet around Rebecca's envelope. Everything she'd built, the attorney, the petition, the confident talk of the full picture, had been constructed around an assumption that was already, quietly wrong. "Then we tell the judge," I said. "Now. Before this goes any further." Alvarez shook his head, gently but firmly. "Not yet. If we reveal the trust before the hearing, her attorney may simply withdraw the petition and refile later, better prepared, once he's had time to research what he's actually up against. Right now they're building a case on an incomplete picture. That advantage disappears the moment they know what we know." I understood then why my own instinct, to end this quickly, cleanly, before it could do more damage, was exactly the instinct I needed to resist. "So we let it proceed," I said. "Exactly as scheduled." "Exactly as scheduled," Alvarez agreed. "And you say nothing until I tell you it's time." Word travels fast in a family that has already decided how a story ends. I heard secondhand that Rebecca had told her aunt the guardianship was basically settled, that her attorney seemed confident, that it was only a matter of paperwork and patience now. I heard she and Daniel had started discussing, quietly at first and then not so quietly, which duplex made the most sense to sell first once everything was sorted out. I said nothing to correct any of it. I had learned, by then, the particular power of letting people finish building a house on ground they hadn't checked. While Rebecca made her plans, I made mine, just as carefully. I called Alvarez twice that week to confirm the hearing date hadn't moved. I called Walter and asked him to bring the original trust documents himself. Not copies, not summaries, the actual signed pages, with him in the room in person, on the day of the hearing. He agreed without hesitation, the way an old friend agrees to something he's known might be necessary for years. I did not mention any of this to my daughter. Not the calls, not Walter, not the folder I had already begun preparing on my kitchen table in the evenings, page by page, the way I once balanced a difficult ledger, slowly, and without announcing each step to anyone watching. At Sunday dinner, Rebecca reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. The same gesture she'd used since she was a girl trying to soften bad news. "I know this feels hard, Mom," she said. "But this is for your own good. You'll see that once it's done." I looked at her a long moment. My daughter, who had spent 6 weeks building a case against a version of me that no longer matched the truth, who was already mentally walking through the rooms of a house that had never been hers to sell. I thought about the folder waiting at home. I thought about Walter, and the 2 doctors no one had ever contacted, and the quiet, patient advantage sitting untouched in a filing cabinet Robert had bought before Rebecca was even born. "I know you believe that," I said gently, and meant every word of it. She smiled, mistaking my calm for surrender. The same mistake she'd made in the kitchen with the envelope. The same mistake she was about to make in front of a judge. She had no idea that her final, confident push, the dinner table reassurance, the certainty in her voice, was the exact thing that would force my hand sooner than even Alvarez had planned. 3 days later, we were back in that courtroom, and this time, the folder in front of me was no longer closed by accident. It was closed because it was waiting for its moment. The recess ended, and the courtroom filled back in the same order it had emptied. Rebecca and her attorney on the right, Alvarez and I on the left, Walter Pines now seated quietly behind us with a leather folio resting on his knees like it weighed nothing at all. "Your Honor," Alvarez began, rising, "before we continue, I'd like to introduce some documentation relevant to the petitioner's claims regarding my client's assets." Rebecca's attorney looked up sharply, the way a man looks up when he hears a word he didn't expect in a room he thought he understood. "Objection, Your Honor. This wasn't disclosed in discovery." "It didn't need to be," Alvarez said calmly. "It's my client's own trust, not the petitioner's. I'm happy to have Mr. Pines, the trustee, address the court directly." The judge nodded, and Walter rose unhurried and confirmed his name, his firm, and the fact that he had served as trustee of a revocable trust holding 3 residential properties and a savings account for the past 26 years. He explained in the plain, unhurried language of a man who had said such things 1,000 times before, that the trust contained a specific incapacity provision, one requiring 2 independent medical evaluations and trustee review before any control over the assets could shift to anyone, guardian or otherwise. "And has any such evaluation been requested?" the judge asked. "No, Your Honor," Walter said. "Not by this petition, and not by anyone connected to it. My office has received no contact whatsoever regarding these proceedings." I watched Rebecca's attorney's face change in real time. The particular stillness of a man realizing the ground beneath his argument had never existed the way he assumed. He leaned toward Rebecca and whispered something urgent. She didn't look at him. She was looking at me. "Which means," the judge said slowly, "that regardless of how I rule on personal guardianship today, these specific assets remain entirely outside this court's reach unless the trust itself is separately and properly challenged, with medical evidence this petition does not contain." The room held its breath the way my kitchen had, weeks earlier, over an envelope no one had signed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't look at Rebecca the way she had once looked at me, with pity dressed up as concern. I said only one sentence the entire hearing, quietly, to no one and everyone at once. I only ever asked to be asked. The judge turned back to Rebecca's attorney, and her questions were no longer gentle. "Counselor, did your firm conduct any financial discovery into Mrs. Hartley's actual holdings before filing this petition? Any title search, any inquiry into trust instruments, Anything beyond the petitioner's own assumptions? He hesitated long enough that the answer was already clear before he spoke it. We relied on the petitioner's representation of her mother's finances, Your Honor. I see, the judge said. And something in those 2 words carried more weight than an hour of shouting ever could have. She did not rule immediately. Instead, she asked Alvarez to submit a formal filing detailing the trust's provisions and Walter's standing as trustee, to be entered into the record before any final decision on the guardianship itself. We'll reconvene once that's filed, she said, and called for a short recess. As the room began to empty, I touched Alvarez's sleeve. There's one more document, I said quietly. I think it's time the court saw it. I had carried the envelope with me all day, tucked inside the same folder that had sat closed on the table that first morning. Alvarez didn't know what was inside it. Walter did, because he was the one who had notarized it, sealed it, and filed a copy in his own office long before any of this began. I hadn't told either of them exactly when I intended to use it. I simply knew, the moment the judge called us back into session, that the moment had arrived. The room settled the way rooms do when everyone senses something is about to happen, but no one knows what. Rebecca sat straighter than before, her attorney's earlier confidence gone, replaced by the careful posture of a man trying to look prepared for whatever came next. I waited until Alvarez had finished his introductory remarks on the trust filing before I leaned toward him and placed the sealed envelope in his hand. He looked at it, then at me, a question in his eyes I answered with a small nod. He rose. Your Honor, I'd like to enter one additional document into evidence, with the court's permission. The judge studied the envelope before nodding her consent. Alvarez opened it carefully, the paper inside clearly aged by more than a few months of handling, and began reading aloud, at the judge's request, a letter I had written and had notarized 8 months before Rebecca ever filed a single form. In it, I had documented, in my own words, that I was of sound mind, that I understood exactly what my trust contained and why, and that I was writing this letter not because anything was currently wrong, but because I had begun noticing certain conversations in my family, questions about whether I had everything in order, comments about the future of properties no one had asked me about, and I wanted a dated, notarized record of my own clarity and intentions in case, as I wrote at the time, someone in my family may eventually attempt this. The courtroom was silent enough to hear the pages turn. Page 7 specifically, the judge said, looking up from her own copy. Would everyone please turn to page 7? I watched Rebecca's hands move to the document Alvarez had passed to her attorney, watched her find the page, watched her eyes move down it. I did not need to see the exact words to know the moment she reached them, because I watched something shift in her face that I hadn't seen since she was a little girl caught in a lie she thought no one had noticed. Whatever she believed about how confused, how forgetful, how unaware her mother had become, page 7 made it plain, in a lawyer's careful language and my own signature, that I had understood this possibility long before she ever acted on it. The judge did not rule that day. She asked for additional briefing, gave both attorneys a new hearing date, and reminded the room, pointedly, that any future filings regarding my capacity would need to address the trust directly, with proper medical evidence, not assumption. Rebecca did not look at me as we left the courtroom. I did not go looking for her eyes either. There would be time later for whatever conversation we were eventually going to have, and there were still pages in that folder no one in that room had seen yet, details I had chosen carefully not to enter into evidence that day. The judge asked everyone to turn to page 7. Rebecca had never seen page 1.